The population of people living with Alzheimer's and related dementias in the U.S. is changing and becoming more diverse. But our nation's healthcare and research systems often fail communities of color, poor people, and women. When it comes to clinical trial diversity and sex-based research, America's research system falls woefully short of full inclusion. Our research doesn't include enough people from diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds, so we can't ensure breakthroughs will work for all Americans. Compounding this national tragedy is that Alzheimer's and related dementias have a disproportionate effect on communities of color and women. Despite this increased risk, our healthcare system limits equal access to promising treatments, health services, and interventions essential to stopping Alzheimer's and addressing key risk factors. Black Americans and Latinos are less likely to receive a timely diagnosis or participate in Alzheimer's research. Black Americans and Latinos in the counties with the highest prevalence of Alzheimer's also experience greater levels of social inequity. And the high costs of Alzheimer's care and treatment are limiting economic opportunities for Black and Latino families. The trends are clear and alarming. By 2030, nearly 40% of all Americans living with Alzheimer's will be African American or Latino, unless something is done. Our nation must recognize the role that systemic racism has played in creating this grim reality for families confronting Alzheimer's if we are to address these health disparities at their root. Without action, under-resourced communities will remain at a disadvantage when it comes to advances in brain health. As a result, societal inequities will continue to grow. Our nation's best-in-class healthcare system and research system will continue to shortchange millions of Black and brown families, and they will continue to be left behind. This cannot stand. Our government leaders, the nation's healthcare system, and healthcare industry partners must set and be held to goals for advancing health equity and research recruitment, access to healthcare services, and improvements in quality care. If these steps are taken, our nation can make significant progress in delivering on the promise of brain health for all communities. What kind of national goals can we set to help address systemic racism and access to Alzheimer's health services and research?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another wonderful session in store at the National Alzheimer's Summit in 2020. We appreciate all of you joining us here virtually this year. This session is entitled No Access, No Justice, Addressing Systemic Racism in Alzheimer's Research and Health Services. I'm going to be your moderator. My name is Jonathan Jackson. I am the Executive Director of the Community Access Recruitment and Engagement Research Center at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. We've got a wonderful set of panelists with us here today. We've got Ms. Quita Highsmith, the Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech. We've got Mr. Brian Van Buren, who is a patient advocate living with Alzheimer's disease. We've got Dr. Fabian Sandoval, who is the CEO and Research Director of the Emerson Clinical Research Institute. And we've got Rear Admiral Risharda Araujo, who is the Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and the Director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. But before we start this conversation, we have a quick and special message from Civil Rights Act leader and legend, Reverend Al Sharpton. Reverend Sharpton had his first-hand experience in dealing with our nation's Alzheimer's challenge and has some words of advice for us as we center racial and social justice in our discussion today. Reverend Sharpton.
Well, my mother raised my sister and I in Brooklyn, New York by herself. I was a child of a single parent. And once I was fully grown and on my journey, she moved back south. She was from Alabama. And slowly she began to develop Alzheimer's as well as dementia. And she had two children older than us down in Alabama. And they would call me and say, she's, starting to forget things. And she would leave her house and didn't know how to get back. So finally, I would go down and see her. Finally, we decided to put her in a nursing home. And she didn't even know who I was at one point when I went to visit her. And I think that one of the reasons I'm so committed to this group is that there's nothing that can prepare you for going to see your mother, who in my case was my mother and father, and they don't even know who you are. That we need to take the health conditions in Black America more seriously. We need to be more engaged. When we see that Blacks are twice more likely to face Alzheimer's and dementia, 1 in 3 seniors in this country die from it. This is something that is, as in my opinion, needing a sense of urgency as anything we fight in civil rights. And the race gap in terms of health care is something that we should not tolerate or act like it's some back page problem. It's a real problem, and we need to deal with it in an aggressive manner. There must be an intentional program strategy that includes everybody, including the poorest and the Black community. Many of our communities don't even have healthcare facilities directly in the community. So you've got to be able to develop strategies that will bring them where the care can be available to them. Healthcare is a civil right, and we need to talk about the disparities there like we talk about the disparities in criminal justice and in business and in employment. We need to first use our platforms to get the message out. Secondly, we need to constantly be on the legislators' backs, because they're the ones that regulate and deal with all of this, to say that part of what they need to know as they deal with healthcare companies and all is what is their plan for diversity? What is their plan to work with those that are in the industry that are servicing communities that have been institutionally neglected?
All right, thank you so much for those magical words, Reverend Sharpton. And welcome back, everyone, to our session where we're going to be talking about no access, no justice. Before we jump into our questions, I wanted our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and I'm going to call on them to let you know what's important to know about them before we jump into this much needed and long overdue conversation. We're going to start with Ms. Quita Highsmith, the Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech. Quita.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm Quita Highsmith, Vice President, Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech. And for those that don't know, Genentech is a biotech organization that is considered the founder of the biotech industry. And, you know, I think one of the things that I am very proud about the organization is we've been on this journey thinking about advancing inclusive research for a number of years. And when we think about including patients of color in our research, that is very important to us, at the forefront of what we do. And when we worked on products for COVID, I'm happy and proud to say that in one of our studies, 85% of the patients in the clinical research were people of color from the Navajo Nation, African American, Black. We went also to Kenya, South Africa, and Peru. So this is an important conversation because we can do this. We can include communities of color in research.
Thank you so much, Quita. And that number, 85%, that is astonishing. So I can't wait to talk with you a little bit more about how you got to that number when some of us are struggling for a tenth of that much. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Fabian Sandoval, the CEO and Research Director of the Emerson Clinical Research Institute. Dr. Sandoval.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to be part of this outstanding panel. I'm honored. So Emerson Clinical Research Institute, we're based out of Washington, D.C., but we also serve Northern Virginia and Maryland. We have patients that come to us from as far as Baltimore, almost an hour away from where we are, because we really provide the service of ensuring that our diverse patients are participating in these studies. We have a huge outreach program. We also, through our foundation, we work with the consulates of Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador to educate the communities there and let them know the value and importance of participating in clinical trials. And it's been very successful because of that. I say 99.9% of our patients are from underserved patient populations. Our highest numbers are Hispanics, followed by African Americans, and then some Asian and Caucasians. And then through our TV show, Tu Salud, Tu Familia, which airs every Saturday morning at 11:30 a.m. on Telemundo, through a grant that was offered to us through Genentech, we've been able to continue this outreach, and we're able, actually our Emmy award-winning show that talks about healthcare awareness and clinical trials. So this has been a very big push as far as educating the community is concerned. So having these this outreach effort and working closely with the patients, we have developed that true level of trust, and that's where Emerson Clinical Research now stands.
That is phenomenal to hear, Dr. Sandoval. Those numbers, I thought 85% was impressive, but you raised the bar with 99%, and now we've got Emmys being thrown around here. I mean, we're going to have quite a conversation. We're really leaving everyone else behind. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Sandoval. Next, we've got Rear Admiral Rashada Arrojo with the FDA. Rear Admiral, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, Jonathan. It is a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I'm Rear Admiral Sharday Arrojo. I serve as the Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and Director of the FDA's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And our office works to protect and promote the health of racial and ethnic minority, underrepresented and underserved populations by focusing our work on research and outreach and communication that works towards addressing health disparities. And as you can imagine, a key priority area for us is working to advance racial and ethnic minority participation in clinical trials. So very excited to be here and to have this very important conversation.
Well, thank you so much. We recognize that there's only so much that we can do locally, and we certainly need to be strong partners with your office and the FDA more broadly in order to ensure that we have the infrastructure that we need to guarantee diverse and inclusive research, especially here in the dementia and Alzheimer's space. And then our final panelist that I'm going to introduce to you is Mr. Brian Van Buren, who is one of our wonderful patient advocates who is living with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Mr. Van Buren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Brian Van Buren. I'm a Black gay man living in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am married to a Brazilian, and unfortunately, because of the virus, I have not seen him since March. I was diagnosed in 2015 with early onset Alzheimer's, and I started doing research and was appalled to see that Blacks were diagnosed twice the general population. I serve in a lot of committees, I've spoken at a lot of conventions, and I've yet to meet a single Black person with Alzheimer's. It wasn't until I met B. Smith and her husband at a book signing, and she was the first person who I was able to meet, connect, and we became very good friends. And I learned a lot just by reading her book about what was the journey to be a Black man with the disease.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Van Buren, and really appreciate that you're here and that you're willing to be so vulnerable and open and honest about the shortcomings of our research infrastructure, especially for individuals who hail from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. And I think that really starts us off with the first question, and this is for all four of our panelists. We talk about inclusive research. I think we all recognize, everybody who's watching this recognizes that it's an important thing to do. But why is it important from a scientific perspective? Why is it important from a drug development perspective? Why is it important from an access perspective? Let's move beyond the argument around this being a matter of social justice. What are some scientific and some business reasons to be diverse and inclusive with our Alzheimer's research?
I'll start. I think one of the things that is very important is as we think about where technology is going, and technology is using genetics and genomic information more and more every day. And when we think about the data that is collected in that technology, looking at genomics, the majority, 90% of the GWAS data, which is the genome-wide sequence data, is 90% of that data is white. And it's actually growing more white. In 2016, when we first started to look at some of this, it was 81% of the GWAS data was of European ancestry. And now fast forward to 2020, in a very short period of time, it's jumped up to 90. And here's why it matters. Because most companies, pharma companies, are using artificial intelligence algorithms to make treatment decisions based on the data that they have. And if the data is not diverse, then what's going to happen is the algorithm is going to be built for a white male. right? And so me as a Black female, if my data is not included in the system, that we're not going to be represented, and we're going to be leaving a lot of communities behind. So it is critically important that we have more communities of color participating in the research.
Yeah.
That's
And,
so.
you know,
Go ahead, ma'am.
the other thing I'll just add to what Quita just mentioned, I think that when you think about a clinical trial, just the basics of a clinical trial, we know that from an FDA perspective, it provides us a crucial base of evidence so we can evaluate whether a medical product is safe and effective. And so ultimately, as Quita just described, we want the diversity of the population that are ultimately going to use those products to be included in those trials. We know that persons of different ages, races, and ethnicities can react differently to certain medical products. And we want to make sure that we have enrollment of those trials reflecting the diversity of those that are using the product so that that data can be appropriately analyzed and that more meaningful information can be communicated to the public and in the product labeling.
Nothing else to say. Exactly. These two women are hitting exactly what I would say. We don't know. We need to know the side effects. That's what I'm looking for. So at boots on the ground here in the lab, I'm looking for those side effects. What are those common side effects that our communities have that other communities may not have? And that's what's important. And that's what I tell my patients. We need to make sure it's going to work with your community, with our patients, because when your kids get older, they're going to need this. But if you're not in this study now, we're not going to know if the same side effects are the same for the different populations. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and Mr. Van Buren, is there anything that you'd like to add on this particular matter? You know, from your perspective, why is it important to have diversity in research trials?
Sure. I was going to say that it's extremely important Afro-Americans get involved in clinical studies. Unfortunately for myself, having comorbidity issues such as diabetes and hypertension, I've been denied every study I've tried to get involved with. Also, the fact that I don't have a 24-hour care partner has also excluded me. So those ramifications need to be changed. I am a strong advocate, however, even though my grandfather was part of the Tuskegee study and died from syphilis, I tell people, because there's still a lot of suspicion within the Black community about the medical field, that it did happen. It was a bad thing to happen, but we need to move on from it.
All right, so I want to open this up to the rest of the panelists. You know, all five of us seem to agree that this is important, that it's important for lots of reasons: social justice, science, the quality of our big data sets. We recognize that this is an area of focus and importance, even from the FDA. So the question is, why aren't we doing it? What's stopping us from having that diversity? Is it all just a matter of Tuskegee and inclusion and exclusion criteria for studies? Or are there other factors that are driving this lack of inclusion?
So I think it's a couple of things. I think what Mr. Van Buren said is important for us to hear. Like, Tuskegee is in the minds of people. And we've just fielded some research with 2,000 patients earlier this summer. And patients, and we looked at 1,000 of the general population, 300 LGBTQ, 300 low socioeconomic status, meaning they made less than 35,000, 300 Hispanics, 300 Blacks. And what we found was that the patients don't actually believe that they're going to be treated fairly. The medically disenfranchised, the LGBTQ, the Black, the Hispanic, and the low socioeconomic, they actually think that the system is flawed against them and actively don't trust that the healthcare providers are going to have their best interests at heart. So they're not going to be interested in vaccination trials. They don't trust the testing. And so one of the things that we have to do is we have to reach out to the community to be able to explain what the rationale is so that they are wanting to participate and to be involved, which is one of the reasons why we've worked so closely with Fabian and his Telemundo show, because we've got to get the message out and it's got to be trusted partners in the community. Like Fabian, Dr. Sandoval can talk on his show and give the rationale of why Hispanic patients should participate as a trusted source. We've used many of the materials that Rear Admiral Arrojo from the FDA minority, they provided us that speaks to communities of color. Like, we've got to stop talking at a high level, and we got to get into the barbershop and the beauty salon, and we got to get to the church, because that's where the people are who need to hear the message, and then they will be willing to participate.
Yeah, it's a constant education. Just like we're always, we always have to teach people how to read, right? We always have to keep teaching math. That's something that has to happen from the beginning. We have to continue to preach the value of this. This can't be just for 1 or 2 years and it's it, because then knowledge is going to fade away and we're going to be back to square one. It's a continuous cycle that we have to continue this process, and that's what we're doing. So that's probably the biggest challenge, and ensuring that trust. I mean, we say it over and over again, but now we're actually living it, and we have the proof that it works.
Rear Admiral, I wanted to kind of piggyback off of these thoughts. So we have clear examples, from Quita, from Dr. Sandoval, of what works. We understand that it is possible to have, a lot of underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities participate in research studies. According to the FDA's 2019 clinical trial snapshots, the FDA approved 9 neurologic drugs last year. And according to those snapshots, 77% of the participants for these trials were white. So, in light of some of these counterexamples, what tools does the FDA have at its disposal to really encourage the inclusion of people of color across research studies?
Jonathan, I think that's a really good question. And, the FDA, we have continued to work to increase the participation of diverse populations in clinical trials, from hosting public meetings, developing tools, as well as issuing guidance documents that all work towards supporting diverse participation. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a key priority for the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity is also working to advance racial and ethnic minority participation in clinical trials. And so some of the tools that we have, I'll start with one that you just mentioned. So for example, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA developed drug trial snapshots. Drug trial snapshots provide consumers with information about who participated in clinical trials that supported FDA approval of new drugs. And what's great is that in addition to the information for that particular new drug, they also put out yearly summary reports. And that is basically aggregate data for that particular year based off the products that were approved. And for the example that you mentioned for neurology in 2019, there were a total of 10,390 patients that participated in trials that led to the approvals of 6 new drugs. So how that breaks down is that overall there was about 75% of all participants were women, 77% were white, 10% were Asian, 11% were Black or African American, and 13% were Hispanic. And what we also have within that particular data is the indication. So for example, 4 out of 6 of the products that were approved have indications for diseases and conditions that have a higher prevalence rates within whites. So I think what we have to remember when we're looking at snapshot data is that it's a snapshot of that data within that period of time, and that we are constantly accruing additional data, and even post-approval, we are getting additional data on those particular products. And we also have to remember that when we're thinking about Alzheimer's drugs and working towards advancing, and we have to continue to work toward advancing racial and ethnic minority participation in those trials, as well as broadly across research overall. And some of the ways that we're able to do that, I definitely want to highlight, and I'll kind of speak to this quickly, but I definitely want to highlight that some of the other ways that we're able to work to do that is through issuing guidance documents. We have our 2016 collection of race and ethnicity data and clinical trials guidance document. This guidance highlights FDA's expectations that sponsors enroll participants who reflect demographics for clinically relevant populations with regards to age, gender, race, and ethnicity. We also have the 2017 evaluation and reporting of age, race, and ethnicity specific data in medical device clinical studies. And then most recently, we have a draft guidance that was issued in June 2019. And I think this one's really important to mention because it focuses on enhancing the diversity of clinical trial populations eligibility criteria, enrollment practices, and trial designs. And we just talked about eligibility criteria. And this specific guidance focuses on broadening eligibility criteria, avoiding unnecessary exclusions for clinical trials, and improving trial recruitment so that participants enrolled in trials better reflect the populations most likely to use that drug if the drug is approved, while of course maintaining safety and effectiveness standards. The other area that, speaking to guidance documents, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are continuously working to raise awareness around the importance of minority participation in clinical trials. This is highlighted in 2 guidances that are specific to COVID-19. One is the development and licensure of vaccines to prevent COVID-19, and that guidance specifically states that FDA strongly encourages the enrollment of populations most affected by COVID-19, specifically racial and ethnic minorities. And another guidance that focuses on COVID-19 and developing drugs and biological products for treatment or prevention also states that racial and ethnic minority persons should be represented in clinical trials. And it goes on to talk about how sponsors should ensure that clinical trial sites include geographic locations with a higher concentration of racial and ethnic minorities to recruit a diverse study population. But in addition to guidance, one of the areas that I really think is very important is education. We need to make sure that our communities have information so that they can make informed decisions. And the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, we developed an ongoing campaign that works to provide positive reinforcements through education and multimedia to help address some of the barriers preventing racial and ethnic minorities from participating in clinical trials through a variety of different culturally and linguistically competent strategies, tools, and resources. Quita mentioned some of these earlier. We've developed fact sheets, brochures, and other educational materials in multiple languages that highlight the importance of diverse participation in clinical trials. We have videos and public service announcements. We engage in social media outreach. We want to make sure that we're able to reach the diverse communities that we serve where they are. So we try to have a broad range of materials and outreach and engaging different communities, engaging health professionals, all working to provide that education about why diversity in clinical trials is important. And lastly, I do want to highlight that the other area, when we look at the barriers to participation in clinical trials, we see that those barriers cross multiple sectors. So collaborations and partnerships and engaging and working together so that we can share best practices, that's an area for us that's very important. And of course, collectively, all of these efforts are areas where we're working to continue to advance diverse participation in clinical trials and, of course, ultimately diversity in the data that is submitted to FDA.
Well, thank you for such a wonderfully comprehensive response. So it sounds like there's very clear guidance. It sounds like there are resources. It sounds like there's a collection of best practices. I know this question is going to come up later, and so maybe we can head it off now. Rear Admiral, is there any plans or is there any language within current guidance around enforcement of around mandating or maybe penalties or perhaps incentives to really strongly encourage diverse and inclusive research, especially here for neurologic diseases, particularly focused on dementia? Is that something that you can comment on, or maybe give us a hint about? Just making sure that these policies and these resources are taken seriously, so that the examples that are that were substantiated by Quita and by Fabian, that they are less and less the exception and more kind of the norm and the reality.
So, we work within our regulatory authorities, and one of those ways where we can continue to advance and work towards and really highlighting our current thinking around it is through guidance documents. I highlighted a number of the guidance documents that we have where we really highlight how we strongly encourage and work towards advancing diverse participation in clinical trials. The other thing that happens that, just to highlight, and I'm sure Quita may speak to this as well, is that in addition to the guidance documents we have, we know that within our review divisions, they are talking with sponsors, they're working with sponsors so that we can continue to advance representation, appropriate representation in clinical trials. The other thing that I think it's important to mention, and I can highlight a docket that the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity opened this year. We opened a docket so that we could actually get public input and comment on the strategic priorities for our office. And that offered an opportunity for us to get broad public feedback on where our stakeholders feel we need to do more. So I think that's another area where we're able to seek that public input feedback from across all of our stakeholders on the issues that impact the populations that we serve.
Let me just piggyback
Please.
Sade's comments. First of all, two things. One, transparency. So when the FDA started to do the FDA snapshot so companies could really look at it, it was like, you know what, it's a wake up call, right? Because it was being, for every new drug application, they were putting on their website for the whole world to see what was going on. So like conversations like this bring that to the forefront, right? So we have to be transparent to be really talking about and putting the issue on the table. The other thing is you budget what you value, right? So if it's valuable to you to include diverse patient populations, you will do that. And then when we've been working to move the needle for a number of years, but it takes time. And so luckily, because we've been working and we've had stakeholders like Fabian go through our inclusion exclusion criteria and tell us where the bias was built in, right? In the process, so that we have real world patients, not fairy tale patients, like Mr. Van Buren was talking about. He has Alzheimer's, but he has some other comorbidities, so now he got excluded, right? We got to stop with the fairy tale patient and have a real world patient that is included into the clinical trials. And one of the things that we saw with this study we did on COVID is we went to where the patients are. I mean, it's okay to go to the academic centers, but people are going to the community hospital. They're driving by that facility, and that's the facility they trust, the one that they see, you know, that they drive by. And then, you know, for us, oftentimes in our industry, the pharmaceutical industry, you know, doing a partnership with a new facility is a little bit taboo because it's like, oh, well, it's going to slow us down. We're not going to be able to finish enrollment. That is a myth, and we proved that with this study. It does take a little bit more time to work with a new facility, but what we learned on the back end, it might take us a little bit of extra time on the front end to get that facility up and running. But if you go to where the patients are, you actually enroll faster. And we looked at streamlining our process and really thinking about what is the fewest eligibility criteria that are really needed. And I think COVID is going to help us think about better remote monitoring and other things that we wouldn't have done so quickly had we not been in this time frame. So I definitely think there are things that can be done, but it starts with transparency and the proper budget.
You know, also, don't forget about the site. So the sites also need to be pushed and selected properly. A lot of sites, right? I get paid $10 if I, you know, no matter what color my patients are, I still get paid the same. So unless it's an inherent value to me as the, you know, at our site, which is our only drive-in mission, just because the reason why it's a drive-in mission for me is because I'm Hispanic myself, right? There is a benefit for me to make sure that I get more Hispanics in studies because one day I might need that drug myself, right? So what is the incentive for sites to do it? There isn't, right? It doesn't matter, right? So sponsors are now picking sites to say, all right, can you enroll diverse patients, right? And if they can and they can prove it, then those sites will bubble to the top and they will get selected to be those sites to conduct those studies. That's something because the sponsor companies may have all these great ideas to actually make it happen, but if they pick a site who they're just going to enroll whomever and not have a little bit of that need to include diverse patients, now we're back to square one. So we need to make sure we have that proper fit between the sponsors and the sites to get the right kind of patients in. So sites need to also get on this bandwagon and say, yes, we are going to do this because we see the importance of doing this, because there is no stick like you were asking before, Jonathan, right? The FDA is not going to say you have to do it. And the sponsor companies may say, you really need to kind of sort of do it. So the sites need to say, okay, we're going to do it. That's the important part. So we all need to kind of get nudged a little bit to see that we have to do it. So that's my part. And I see Mr. Van Buren had his hand up.
Oh yeah, I just want to say during the 1990s, I was an AIDS advocate. And what the CDC was doing was basically developing programs believing that one glove fits all. And they were being run by white gay men, with Afro-Americans being excluded. I was able to get funding from the US Conference of Mayors and the CDC to develop community-based organizations, and I started a movement called Brother to Brother. So I would hire gatekeepers within the community, and they would go out and do HIV prevention. We had meetings, groups, all kinds of things. And we were able to make an impact in terms of changing the numbers for African Americans getting HIV.
Okay, so I think that touches on maybe the next place that I'd like to take this conversation. And this is something that I would love Ms. Highsmith, Dr. Sandoval, and Mr. Van Buren to all weigh in on. We have heard over the last several minutes about the importance of community. And we know that when it comes to most Alzheimer's disease clinical trials, we're talking about these large clinical trial networks, where there's GAPNet and ACTC, which tend to favor the larger academic medical centers, the larger hospitals that have large neurology clinics and practices. Tell me about the value of working in a more localized community setting when it comes to diversity. Does it cost more money? Does it take more time? Why aren't more folks doing this?
One of the things that we've been able to do is, in partnership with Us Against Alzheimer's, we had them help us think about where should we go for some of our trial sites. And so, they gave us some feedback. We did a partnership with them on 3 trial sites in Phoenix, in Las Vegas, and in Cleveland for one of our investigational medicines to help us think about how do we really increase minority participation. So we did some coordinated social media ads to drive online and in-person recruitment in these communities. And we did some other things working with Us Against Alzheimer's. And they were successful in bringing out large numbers of individuals from underrepresented communities. But partly we had challenge with, while the interest was high, the sites actually lacked a good strategy. So like to Fabian's point, the site actually, they lacked the strategy. They might not have had materials in Spanish, right? So like, it's what, we can push to the sites, but the sites have to do their part. So they also really didn't do a good job in collecting the demographic data. So we would understand, who was coming to these things. And so I also think that, making sure, as Mr. Van Buren said, like, how do you engage the partner, the caregiver for an Alzheimer's patient? And so oftentimes the industry is just focused on the patient. But in Alzheimer's, you not only have to be focused on engaging and educating the patient, but you also have to be informing the caregiver about the value and all of the things, the tools and tactics that are going to be available. So it is a multifaceted kind of issue.
And so I guess my follow-up question is, do we need new sites in our fight against Alzheimer's disease? Or is there a way to achieve diverse and inclusive research with the sites that we already have, with the sites that are already getting all of the studies? Are there things that they can do to do better?
Yes.
Do they need their own Telemundo show?
Yes,
or?
we need new sites that are part of the community, right? Because what has happened with COVID has really amplified the racial disparity, right? So like if you have to go to an academic center, that's like up on the hill. It's very challenging. I mean, parking is a nightmare. Navigating the facility versus a local site like a Fabian's site where, they are doing things very differently. They provide Uber and Lyft services for the patients to directly get dropped off at the front door so that the patient can just walk in and it's not cumbersome, right? So like more community sites, patients have access to them. And we do need to challenge our, more academic centers to really think about how are they engaging the catchment area, which means the community around them. But so often it's judged on what does your insurance look like? What kind of job do you have? Are you going to be able to take off work and come in here on these certain particular hours where Fabian's office is open on the weekends, right? So much more patient-centered and focused. And the Ivy Towers, they don't have to do that. They have a lot of funding, so they don't have to do anything extra to engage patients because people are going to come, but those are going to be the wealthy patients. And so we need to be thinking about what is our opportunity to engage more communities of color who might not have the same insurance and the same resources to be able to participate in clinical research.
You know, I tell them all, when patients call, when patients see our ads, one of the first things we have on there, it says, we don't care if you have insurance or not. We want to help you. And we don't care of your legal status. We just want to help you. And on the phone, we let them know that right away. It's like, by the way, I know you haven't asked, but we don't care if you have insurance for this particular study, and we don't care about your legal status. You're safe here.
All right, and Mr. Van Buren,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, one minute, Rear Admiral. I wanted to just check in with Mr. Van Buren and talk to him about what kind of place would you want to get your care? What kind of place would you want to see if you were going to participate in a research study? We know that you've tried and that you've been turned away. Are the things that Quita and Fabian have been talking about, are those appealing to you?
Definitely. What I wanted to say was someone in the chat room had asked a question about where do I get my care from? And unfortunately, I'm single and live alone. And being part of the LGBT community, it's not uncommon for us to be individuals living without partners. So you have to develop a treatment team, and that's what I did. I developed a speech therapist, I have a life coach, I have my general practitioner, and even people from the church community. So all these people I keep around me, and they have been really a good asset for me in terms of helping me navigate this disease, especially when I'm at times feeling very much alone. One of the big obstacles is Blacks make up 17% of the population in the United States, but 67% of the COVID deaths.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that speaks to the magnitude of the disparities that we see that cut across, particular research disciplines or disease areas. Admiral Orojo, I'm sorry that I cut you off earlier. Would you like to make your comment?
No problem. I really just wanted to add to what Quita and Fabian had mentioned with regard to the sites. I mean, I think we have to recognize that our sites have to understand and have that same commitment for diversity that we have across the board. So the sites have to also have that commitment for diversity. We also need to make sure that our site study staff, that they are culturally competent and they're able to work with and engage patients, and that we have the resources and materials available in multiple languages. So we have to make sure that, our patients have the information that they need. And I know Quita and Fabian just highlighted this. So again, I just wanted to kind of reinforce again that we have to have that same commitment at the sites level as well.
All right, and so that brings me to, I think, the next topic of conversation. I think we all recognize that every stakeholder has some responsibility, some culpability in trying to move the world forward in terms of being more diverse and inclusive. We know that funders and federal agencies need to prioritize this. We know that our industry partners need to make this a really critical matter for driving innovation. We know that sites need to take this on board, and maybe we need to be picking new research sites to do this. But who has to start? Where do we begin? Do we need some stricter guidance from NIH and FDA? Do we need more companies like Genentech to really take the lead? Do we need sites, maybe the ones that have been historically funded, to kind of take this and make this a central aspect within the larger emergent clinical trial networks that we're seeing in the Alzheimer's space? Where do we start? Who has to take the first shot to get this right?
So I think it is multiple people, right? Like, it's not just one stakeholder, right? Like, we need to have communities of color participating, and we as a community of color need to encourage like friends and family, loved ones to participate, right? Because the thing is, a lot of us get our information from one another. So the more that we can encourage our own friends and family community to participate so that we know that the products that are coming out onto the market are safe and effective for us, the better we will all be. And then secondly, we do need the industry. We need hospitals, we need investigators, we need legislators and policymakers to actively stand up and build trust and ask for Black and Latinx people to be involved in clinical research. And then lastly, we need insurance companies, employers, states, the federal government to cover, because right now there are only 13 states that cover clinical trial research for Medicaid patients. So we need more coverage for clinical research.
All right. Do any other panelists want to weigh in on who has to start? Rear Admiral Orojo, Mr. Van Buren?
I can add to what Quita just mentioned. I think she highlighted it exactly. We know that there isn't just this one size fits all solution to, advancing diverse participation in clinical trials. And in all of the examples where we've seen success, they're working across multiple sectors. They're engaging patients. They're working with sites. They're, industries involved. So we have to make sure that we're all working together to continue to advance representation in trials, because there isn't a one size fits all solution. And on top of that, we know that there are multiple areas and sectors that are involved, and we have to all be at the table. We have to all have responsibility, and we have to all work together.
All right, and Mr. Van Buren, from your perspective, having been turned away from multiple clinical trial opportunities, who needs to start? Who has to get this going? I think you might be muted, sir. I apologize.
I have a responsibility, and when I first got diagnosed, I came out because I was a Black man with Alzheimer's, and I needed to let people see that I am a productive, happy living person. I wear a button that says advocate living with Alzheimer's all the time. And I get into some conversations with many, many people around that subject, and I make hundreds of referrals to different organizations, because these people will talk about their loved one having these symptoms and not really knowing what's going on. And I'm able to explain to them that, they have Alzheimer's or dementia. The other thing I wanted to say was, I think one of the big obstacles in terms of care is that only 5% of doctors in the United States are Afro-American. And so I don't think they're really looking out for the general population, like people like me. And I, for the most part, think most people wouldn't trust a white doctor giving them a diagnosis or any kind of information.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are many stakeholders. We all have a responsibility. But Ms. Highsmith, Mr. Van Buren, I think you in particular said that there needs to be some positive movement from within our communities in order to really to really create a groundswell and then encourage these much larger actors to capitalize on it.
Absolutely, we must be vocal.
Yes. Well, one of the good things that's happening is that a lot of these organizations are including people with Alzheimer's. Prior to that, you would never see anyone on a board or a committee that had Alzheimer's. And the reality is that we are the experts on the subject.
So, Mr. Van Buren, would you say that that's a must for clinical trials moving forward, that somebody living with Alzheimer's disease be part of the research design team?
Absolutely.
Definitely. All right. I think that's a great suggestion. At this point, I was going to start to turn to some of the audience questions that have been submitted. But do any of the panelists have other final thoughts about any of the topics that we discussed?
No, I think that having this conversation, and we need to stop tiptoeing around race and health inequity and have the open conversation out in the public so that we can really start to address some solutions versus whispering about it and maybe reading a research paper about it, but actively having discussions so we can make real change.
I couldn't agree more. I think we need to be even bolder than we have been in this conversation today. And so here's hoping that we're able to do that. So my first question, it's not directed to anybody in particular, but I think it is probably directed to Dr. Sandoval, and maybe Ms. Highsmith will be able to weigh in. And the question is actually pretty short. It says, are community health centers effective in neurological trials? There seems to be a lot of skepticism implied in that question, Dr. Sandoval. Would you be able to weigh in?
Yes. So are community centers able to manage those? Is that the question?
Yes, I think that is what the question is.
So I think it depends on the study that's being conducted and being selected as a site. So I'll pivot that by saying, you know, we do some asthma studies, for example. We don't have allergists on board, right? But we see those types of patients, right? So are the sponsors willing to trust our abilities to manage those patients, even though the staff may not be an allergist, right, on board? Because they focus so much on, well, it has to be a dermatologist, it has to be an allergist. And I go back to them and say, those providers are specialists and they're not coming to the community-based or the FQHCs that would see these tons of patients. So the GPs have the experience to see these patients. So give us the study. So if they do award us the study, then in that case, yes, those institutions are able to manage those types of treatments, because we have to remember, we are not doing the study alone. We have medical monitors, we have all types of colleagues that are helping us run these studies, not just from within the site, but that sit further up from the sponsor companies that can help guide us if we run into any issues.
So I guess the follow-up question is, you know, what about some of the hard equipment that may be required? You know, so for example, many Alzheimer's studies today require, you know, kind of advanced PET scanning capabilities. Is that something that you feel would be possible at a community health center, or would you need to partner with a larger academic medical center for these kinds of scans?
Well, yes, absolutely. We partner, and we set, you know, from a business point, we actually have to set up separate contracts directly with those institutions so that we can send our research patients for those procedures, and then we make sure that the patients are charged, you know, for those procedures. But yes, I do it all the time, right? We do DEXA scans and MRI scans all the time in our studies. We don't have like that equipment here. We just send them to the hospitals that do have them, or radiology facilities that have them. And it actually works really well because patients get in and out much quicker, because those companies realize that I'm going to pay them right away. They're not waiting for insurance companies 6 months down the road to reimburse them. I do it, you know, within 30 days of the patient being seen. So it works well.
And I think I will just add, whether, you know, a community health center can do a complicated study or not, what we need though is the center that does have the study to be partnering with the community health center, because that's where the patients are. And so they need to be reaching out to say, we have a study and we're interested in getting people to participate, and here's how we're willing to work with you. Because I do feel like community health centers have the patients. You have to go to where the patients are in order to diversify the clinical research.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a great opportunity to implement maybe like a hub and spoke model, where, you know, the sites that we traditionally consider for clinical studies can then set up contracts and agreements with local community health centers in order to ensure that the trial remains viable and effective, but that it can reach a much broader set of individuals. There's another question here from the audience, and this one is for Rear Admiral Arrojo. Have there been medical product labels that are differentiated by race?
So where we have data, the product labeling will highlight where there may be a variability in response for particular products with regard to race and ethnicity. So yes, and that information is captured in the product labeling. Okay,
thank you. So this next question is, I think, for everyone to weigh in on, and I would love to hear all four of you respond to this question. And so it's a little bit of a long one, so bear with me. Since systemic racism produces the conditions under which there is reluctance to participate in Alzheimer's research, it doesn't seem likely that increasing inclusiveness in recruitment will address the underlying problem. So I think what the question is saying at first is, if we increase diversity in clinical trials, it doesn't address the systemic causes that make it hard to have that diversity in the first place. How do we, with all of our different levels of expertise, how do we address both recruitment and the underlying causes of disparities in research participation? So how do we create more diversity by race, but also address systemic racism?
I think I mean, I'm not harping on education, but it's a matter of, you know, one person at a time, right? I can't change the world that quickly. None of us can do it that way. It has to be a small ripple effect. We have to show that it's possible, and we're doing it. We're showing that it's possible. We have to bring in also diverse providers. Like Mr. Van Buren said, you know, he's not going to want to go to a white physician because he may not trust him. We need to break that trust as well. We need to make sure that Mr. Van Buren can trust a Hispanic physician, can trust a white physician, right? But it's not anyone's fault. It's just the nature of humankind that's where we have to you know, break those barriers. But it's a matter of doing this ripple effect of saying, now we're selecting African-American providers to become investigators. We need to teach investigators. We need to grow investigators at a younger age. We need to grab these young physicians and teach them the value of clinical trials, right? And it's not that hard if we just do it slowly. I have interns in my office every day, right? We have now 6 interns. There was no room for us because all these students wanted to learn, which was amazing, right? And they're all of diverse backgrounds. So that's what we need to do. That's what I think I need to do. It's a hard we to generalize, but that's the little gold seed that I'm trying to implant to make something happen.
Yeah, I agree with what Fabian just described. I think that when we're thinking about clinical trials and access, and I think we have to also think about those social determinants of health and how that impacts our health outcomes. It impacts our ability to participate and be aware. And I think education is important. We have to make sure that our communities have the education so that they can also understand what a clinical trial is, what it means to participate, so that they can also advocate for participation in clinical trials. We've talked about the importance of our sites. We've talked about the importance of having patients at the table. We've talked about the importance of all of us kind of bearing that responsibility so that we can get towards where we need to be. So I think that the education piece can't be overstated, that it is really important when we think about all of access as well as advancing representation in trials.
So let's have some real talk, right? So like,
let's hear it, Quita.
Let's have some real talk, right? Like, this is a multifaceted, complex problem, and there is no magic solve, right? It is grinding, hard work, commitment, still resolve, and we have to be transparent, like having these conversations, putting the issue on the table, holding people accountable. We have to be intentional in what research we are doing, what sites we're going to, and we have to be bold, right? That is the only way we're going to make change. We cannot keep doing the same old. It is time for us to step outside the box and hold one another accountable. This is our time right now.
All right, so I think with that inspiration, I want to piggyback off of some of the questions about what accountability looks like. Who's in charge of accountability? What are we accountable for? Are we going to be accountable for increasing overall diversity? Should we be accountable for some of these educational outcomes that Fabian and Rasharda have been advocating for? What does accountability look like in this space? How do we know that we're doing it right?
Accountability is people who have the demographics of the people who have the disease are represented in the clinical trial. Accountability is people who have the disease are treated fairly and equitably, right? Accountability is that comorbidities don't prohibit you from participation. That's what we have to be accountable for.
Okay. And so I guess my question is, does accountability just mean enforcement? Does that mean something, you know, as clear cut as if you don't have a representative research sample in your phase 3 trial, you cannot, you cannot apply for FDA approval, you know, no matter what your outcomes are. Like that's a pretty hard line. Is that what accountability looks like, or are we talking about something a little bit less, something a little bit different, something outside of just your you know, what your sample representation demographics looks like? What do we mean by accountability?
So, you know, are we going to have a law, right? I was
Yeah, that's the question, right? Are we going to have a law?
I'm actually going to email. I've got some people I wasn't talking to about this, right? The law is not there. The only law that I know about clinical trials right now is 10 U.S.C. 980, right? Which is a law. It's that says a soldier can only receive $50 for a blood sample. And the only reason I know that is because I used to work for the Army, right? So 10 U.S.C. 980 is the only law that I know in clinical trials like that. We need something like that. So for accountability, I would love to see something like that, because that would work. The only other accountability I see from my end as a site is that a sponsor says to me, hey, you said you were going to bring in 10 Hispanic patients. Where are they? You know what? I don't think I'm going to give you another study. That's what I want to see, that, because for me, I'm safe because I got plenty of them, right? But that's what we need to do. That's what I would like to see. And that would encourage sites to say, oh man, okay, let me go find some other patients, and not just do what we normally do, because that's what we need to get from a site's perspective. That's what I need. I need other sponsors to say, get me more Hispanic patients, give me more African-American patients. If not, I'm not going to give you any more work. Easy.
All right. What are other thoughts from other panelists? Does this seem reasonable?
You know, I don't know, because here's the reality is, are we going to say because you didn't have X number of diverse patients that the patients you did have don't have a right to have access to treatments? I don't know that we want to go down that path.
But they can show you that, at least show me that you tried.
Exactly. But I do think that the more transparency we can put out here, like the calling out, if you don't have diversity in your study, that people know about it, and that payers say, you know what, I'm not sure that I should be reimbursing for a product that is not, going to be able to cover the majority of the people that have the disease. Like, there are accountability things that can be done without potentially injury to patients who actually need products.
Yeah, you know what? Because you don't want then sites to say, oh, well, we already have enough, Hispanics. We already have enough Caucasians. We can't put you in the study. That's wrong too. I mean, I bring anybody that comes in the door, right? So we need, that's a really good point, Guido. We have to be mindful of that. So everyone's welcome.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about transparency and accountability, I mean, we can highlight, and we've highlighted this earlier, we have drug trial snapshots. You can see what that representation was for certain products. And the other thing, I think when we talk about accountability, we spend a lot of time talking about we need to engage communities, we need to have patients at the table, but you have to be accountable on how you do that. You can't step in for one trial and then you're done and you're not engaging with that community anymore. That's not going to help us build trust. That's not going to help us get patients to want to participate in these trials.
So that actually brings me back to a question that I had earlier. So if we were to do some of the things, Dr. Sandoval, that you've done at your research institute, if we kind of bring that to, USC, if we bring that to, a major academic medical center, is that enough? Is that enough to drive trust? Is that enough to drive recruitment? Is it just about copying your model and implementing it in another place? Or does that mean, do we need to do something different?
No, copy it. Yeah, I mean, go get some tables, go get some tents, and go stand at the metro station, go stand by the bus station and talk to people. Tell them about their studies. Do free screenings. My interns right now are setting up a plan to go do some diabetic macular edema screenings at like some farmers market, right? We'll all be covered up and stuff, but be there. You know, Quita said it several times, go to where the patients are. So yeah, implement my strategy at, you know, any of these other institutions, but do it right. Do it consistently. Make sure it always happens. Not a one and done, just like Captain Rear Admiral Rojo said, it's not a one and done type of thing. It has to be consistent. You have to do it multiple times. So yeah, do it, replicate it. It's super easy. Go out, go into the community. That's what we need to do. And then bring it back to the clinic.
So Mr. Van Buren, would that change your mind if one of these large academic medical centers, these fancy ivory towers, as we've called them, if they did some of the things that we've heard about from Dr. Sandoval and from Ms. Highsmith, if they had like a great television show that aired weekly and that was Emmy Award winning, if they gave you a Lyft or an Uber ride to and from the research center, is that enough to gain your trust? Is that enough to gain your interest, or do they need to do more?
Oh, I think they definitely need to do more, but bigger is not always better.
What do you mean by that? What? Yeah.
You're talking about these big ivory tower organizations or clinics or whatever. I would be afraid of them in order to go to them, because I would just feel overwhelmed for the most part, I think.
Just because it's a large, imposing institution? And
absolutely, yes.
So it sounds like they would need to try to engage with you in a different way. You know, maybe not have you come in to that large facility as often. So if you could interact with them,
right.
at a satellite location, or like at a local CVS or a Walgreens or something, maybe.
And that's it. Perfect.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that's a perfect example why we need to have patients at the table and helping us as you design trials. Perfect example.
I couldn't agree more. I had one more question from the audience that I think is directed to Ms. Highsmith, but I think anyone could weigh in. Would Genentech use a clinical trial site that had no neurologists? I think this is a follow-up from Dr. Sandoval's comments earlier.
It's specific to Alzheimer's.
So an Alzheimer's protocol, would you do it? Would you give a site a contract, an award, if they had no neurologists?
I think one of the things that we're looking for, and we received from Us Against Alzheimer's a heat map of where the patients are that have the disease. So what we will be thinking about is more or less, where are the patients versus where are the neurologists? So I don't know that we would use a site that doesn't have a neurologist, but we certainly want to go to the places where diverse communities are. And they gave us, and so we're overlaying the map that Us Against Alzheimer's provided with where we're looking to do clinical research. So I think that if there wasn't a neurologist, if there was a referral pattern for patients, that would be ideal. It would be a community facility that had a neurologist, that had a diverse community access to diverse patients.
So I guess this is a question that's just coming from me now. Would it be possible for companies like Genentech to help build capacity at community sites where you could, cover, a neurologist's time, for a few hours a month in order to help increase capacity and ability to conduct these clinical trials? Is that the solution? Is the solution, instead of trying to create more diversity at the sites that already have the trials, build capacity at the sites that don't, but do have access to diverse populations? Is that something that Genentech is considering, or would be willing to try? Or
Yep, absolutely. We just had our and Fabian's a part of our external council. So we have a council that is made up of clinical trial researchers, patient advocate organizations, and Stephanie Monroe from Us Against Alzheimer's is part of that, as well as academics. and community centers. And that is exactly what they have suggested. And it is exactly what we're going to be looking to roll out at the beginning of next year, is what we're calling Advanced and Inclusive Research Site Alliance, where we're going to be working with sites to help build capacities in the community. And these sites would be able to do not only very early studies, but the late stage, phase 3, and would be able to do post-marketing.
It sounds like that may kind of be bringing in a new era for thinking creatively, not just about who gets to conduct these clinical trials in terms of sites, but the design of the studies themselves. So,
and luckily, we've got a great group that's been with us for 3 years, pushing us to move the needle, to think differently, because obviously if we had all the answers, we would have been doing better. So which is why we worked with the external counsel to really help us think about things that we are not thinking about, and facilities like Dr. Sandoval that are working with communities to engage them in research, right? So like it's important for us to kind of go to the experts so they can give us feedback, and based on that feedback, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to do a pilot with 3 facilities that we're going to see how it works, and then we're hoping to build capacity and expand.
all right, so we've actually just only got about 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes left. So now it's time to go around the panel and hear some final thoughts. Rear Admiral Araujo, I wanted to know if you would be able to lead us off with any concluding thoughts or some kind of summary statement of how you felt about some of the points that we discussed today, or anything that you wanted to bring up.
I think my final thought would be that, one, I think that these types of conversations and this conversation is really important because it helps us to continue to work together and find ways that we can continue to advance minority participation in clinical trials. So I think conversations like this are needed. And in addition to that, we need the actions to back up the conversations that we're having. And we've heard a wealth of information from Mr. Van Buren today on what patients want, what they need, and what they expect. And I think that's really important for us to consider. We need to we have to engage our communities. We need to work with patients. We need to make sure that we have all of us at the table working together, from sites to industry to FDA and others. So I think that conversations like this are very important because it gives us that opportunity to really highlight and share best practices, where we've been successful and where we need to continue to do work.
All right, thank you so much. Dr. Sandoval, your final thoughts.
I believe that we just need to step outside our door, right? We need to open up the doors of your clinics, look outside of the communities that you're serving, and start talking to those people and bring them in, right? We need to look at the fact that, the large institutions have tremendous value because they have services that our smaller community-based clinics don't have access to, is working together with these large institutions to make it happen and allow us at the community level settings to do more work for our patients and continue that trust that we're doing. So we're on the right path. We just need to do a lot more.
All right, Ms. Highsmith.
I will just say, we all have to be change makers, right? We have to challenge the status quo. We have to ask more questions. Patients need to say, I want to participate in clinical research. We need investigators to ask every patient, not just the patient with the best insurance and the best outfit on. We need to be continuously educating communities of color because they will get left behind. And I am very concerned about that. And I want to ensure that we take this moment right now that we have and we make it a movement. And just as much as we're making other changes, we have to ensure that health equity is front and center.
Absolutely. All right, so Mr. Van Buren, final thoughts, bring us home.
Yes. I'm very impressed with the panel, and I'm very honored that I was included in this conversation because, as I said, being a person with Alzheimer's, I have a lot to bring to the table.
All right, so thank you to the audience. Thank you so much to our panel. This has been No Access, No Justice. We've talked about how to address systemic racism in Alzheimer's research and health services. But I think that Quita said it best. Since you are part of the audience, since you are part of the panel, it is on you to be a change maker. So go out there, make some changes. Thank you so much for watching.